So today I want to discuss profiling because I think of it as being similar to people who say that they're woke, how they're generally the most asleep. Well, people who use terms like racial profiling or gender profiling usually understand the terms that they're using the least. I mean, we hear all about how bad racial and gender profiling is, and most people would assume that those terms are synonymous with racist or sexist. In reality, like the word diversity, profile is not charged as being either good or bad. It's the subject being acted upon by a descriptor. But people have been conditioned to no longer think about what it means to profile someone or something, but instead they assume that if there are racial or gender differences, then it must be a sign that someone is being oppressed for their race or their gender, when in reality that might not be the case at all. So let's start this discussion with a definition of what it means to profile someone or something. Now, the best definition that I could come up with is that to profile something means that you assess every piece of that thing that's relevant to the inquiry at hand. So to profile in the first place implies that there's a goal you're trying to accomplish. That's why you're trying to analyze the subject for something. You're breaking that subject, either a person or an object, into their parts that would appear relevant to the overall goal. So when we break it down like this, we can see that we profile things every day. We just live in a culture that likes to assume every race and both genders are exactly the same. So profiling in either of those cases is seen as abhorrent. Now, with nationalized military, police, and courts, it's difficult to know exactly how the free market would look at profiling someone based on their gender or their race, but there are instances where I can see it making sense, and there are other instances where it would be the result of unfounded prejudices and not backed by anything statistics based. The fact of the matter is that there are times where racial profiling can make sense. An example of that I would see as being a legitimate example is if you have a violent Mexican gang controlling a neighborhood. So people of Mexican descent are disproportionately walking around the neighborhood carrying weapons and engaging in violent crimes. It would be perfectly sensible to think that stop and frisking Mexicans in this area would make sense for the safety of the peaceful people living in the neighborhood. So another example, say that somehow 13% of the population managed to commit, 50% of the crime. And you're someone entrusted with keeping the community safe, because I just want to say keeping the community safe because I'd rather remove police employed by the state entirely from these scenarios. I'm trying to isolate what it means to profile someone. So if you're in a high crime area, you'd want someone who's entrusted with keeping the community safe to be questioning and stopping and frisking people in this 13% far more than 13% of the time. And I understand the argument saying, well, if I have nothing to hide, then what do I have to fear? It doesn't exactly apply to scenarios where the state is exceeding or growing their power. So like when it comes to the surveillance or the police state, it's a dangerous excuse for power. But when it comes to how communities would function under the free market, certain types of profiling should be preferred by citizens that abide by the voluntarily agreed guidelines and conditions in their community because it's more efficient at deterring crime. And the free market strives for efficiency. People might have some type of guttural reaction to being stopped and frisked, but assuming that the state hasn't gotten to a point where stopping and frisking can be weaponized against a peaceful person, which is why I'm trying to remove the state from this argument, it could statistically make sense in terms of protecting the community. Now, this leaves a fine line between what could be justified to the community by the private defense firm representing them and the preferences of that society. What I mean here is, if a private community defense firm wants to try to make the case for pulling over cars based on the race of the person driving the car, then they can. It's up to the community to decide if they see race as a legitimate factor in someone's ability to adhere to the communally set rules of the road. The obvious issue here is that if a significant amount of the private community defense firm's funding comes from the group that they should statistically be going after, the community would either devolve due to the dysfunction, they'd change their dysfunctional ways, or they just change their standards because the action isn't terribly dysfunctional. And the reason that this might seem like it's going off into the weeds is that, again, you're walking this fine line between what the private community defense firm statistics show would be a more efficient way of protecting the area and what the community would accept as a legitimate case for profiling. The reason that this issue has to be broken down this way is so that you can see that calling racial profiling or gender profiling bad is because we live in a culture that just has a guttural reaction to race and gender preference in certain situations. Obviously, double standards exist today, but like I said before, people like to think that all races are the same and both genders are exactly identical. But they're not. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad to be different, but it depends what issue is at hand. The fact that we're discussing an issue in the first place requires profiling in some way because we need direction to figure out how to behave towards that issue. It's foundational that people identify, categorize, and extrapolate cause and effect. That's all that profiling is. So when you see someone proclaim that all racial profiling is bad or all gender profiling is bad, push them on what they're saying. They're either unaware of the conclusions that their stance implies, or they're actually trying to say that for the issue at hand, race plays no role or gender plays no role. And for some issues, I'd say that that's true. For other issues, it's not. My problem is when people paint with a broad brush, but it's up to the agency entrusted with protecting the community to figure out what's efficient and pair that with what the community would accept. Now, one issue with police being an arm of the state is that they're allowed to be infinitely wasteful. So emotions can always triumph over efficiency. That's where we're at now. And I understand the individual rights side of this, but again, we're talking efficiency, not rights. Only a government can give you rights. Otherwise, it's up to you to take what you can get. So if my financial situation meant that I had to live in a high crime area, I'd choose one where the communal defenders might profile me with what I see as a justified cause. If that's the case, that would be fine because I know it would be helping me to be safe. One of the toughest barriers for me to break out of was thinking that we have God-given rights, but if someone is going to violate those rights, literally nothing stops them. If a government decides that they want to violate what you see as a God-given right, they will. So take your rights for yourself. Think of how privately funded communal defenders would operate and contrast that with how the state-supported police function. There are a lot of differences, but there are plenty of similarities too. There are times where individual rights can become wasteful, and if you choose that you want certain rights over that efficiency, there would be a community like that because other people would likely agree with you. But if you want a maximally efficient community, you'd have to start to think of rights in a different sense, or really just a more refined sense. But that's a topic for a future video. I hope that this explained the issue of profiling better than you'd ever get from the media or from many other political or philosophical voices. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe. I'll be increasing activity on this channel and I'll be moving live streams over here, including political stuff. So if you don't know my main channel, I've linked it down in the description. It's called The Right Media. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.